On June 4, 1961, in the depths of the Cold War, John Kennedy had a summit meeting in Vienna with Nikita Khrushchev. The meeting began awkwardly and soured quickly. Sensing weakness, Khrushchev berated, belittled, and bullied Kennedy on a range of issues, and then ratcheted up the pressure even more, threatening Western access to Berlin and warning that force will be met with force. If the U.S. wants war, that's its problem. Kennedy stood firm, but afterwards he told New York Times columnist James Reston that Khrushchev beat the hell out of me. It was the worst thing in my life. He savaged me. Historians have concluded that Kennedy's performance at the summit encouraged Khrushchev to think that afterwards Kennedy was a lightweight, which may have laid the groundwork for the Cuban Missile Crisis the following year. Khrushchev himself said he felt he had triumphed over a weak and inexperienced leader and that Kennedy seemed morose at the end. Kennedy looked not only anxious, but deeply upset, Khrushchev reported. The negotiations that matter most to us often raise serious emotional stakes. These negotiations become even more complex and dangerous because of the presence of surprising psychological dynamics. And we all sense this problem of emotions in negotiation. In fact, one of the most common questions negotiation instructors get is this one: "Professor, all this negotiating advice sounds great, but what do I do when I'm in the middle of the talks and I'm overwhelmed with my feelings?" That's a very good question. As former heavyweight champion Mike Tyson put it, everyone has a plan until he gets punched in the face. Or, as one popular office cartoon puts it, stress is the confusion created when the mind overrides the body's basic desire to choke the life out of some ridiculous jerk who desperately needs it. So what do you do? In this session, we'll look at a number of specific, powerful ways to cope with the emotions and the psychological dynamics present in difficult negotiations, and so improve the odds of turning the talks into something much better than a blow-up or a breakdown. Specifically, we'll look at the power of role-playing, discussion rules, warning sandwiches, and the intentional use of measured anger. And we'll see how key ideas we've encountered before may help us cope in fresh ways. Over the years, I found that one of the best ways to help my students manage their anxiety is to role-play with them. Typically, when a student asks me for counsel, I'll first ask her to systematically prepare using the "I foresaw it" preparation mnemonic we explored in an earlier session. Then, I'll ask the student to meet with me. I'll ask her to briefly review the situation with me, tell me about any questions she's had completing her plan, and then tell me about the other negotiator. What is he like? What is his manner and style? What will his attitude likely be? Then, I'll immediately assume the role of her counterpart and ask her to go right into a role play of the upcoming negotiation. Action! And there we are, suddenly in the emotional reality of the upcoming talks. I intentionally make it difficult, being as resistant, aggressive, and unpersuadable as my character would plausibly be. After a few minutes, we stop. "How's this going?" I ask. Almost inevitably, my student replies, "Terribly." "Great," I say, because this is the time and place to safely have this experience and get ready for it, just as a test taker wants to do very challenging practice exams to be ready for anything in the actual test room. We talk and explore ways to apply her preparation more fully, ways to slow the process down, and ways to channel the resistance back onto the problem by bringing to bear things like creative options and good research, skilled listening, and question asking. Then we resume, and it gets somewhat better. We debrief again. We may even reverse roles. After a while, the student feels encouraged. "I'm starting to see it," she says. "I feel better." Not always. We've all felt keyed up on the eve of a big exam, even when we're really ready. But now the student has in effect been through it already. In this regard, role-playing lets negotiators do much the same work that top athletes do when they visualize their performance before an event itself. Sports psychologists train them to do this. You may have seen skiers and gymnasts on the sidelines at the Olympic Games visualizing just before they begin their performances. Studies suggest that when an athlete visualizes a performance, her body physiologically experiences the performance as if it actually happened and actually acquires enhanced muscle memory that can translate into better performance. And it turns out negotiators can get the same benefit. Students of mine who systematically use the approach usually say that they like it and would definitely do it again. The value of role-playing makes you wonder about what happened at Vienna. Speaking of Khrushchev, in the aftermath of the Vienna conference, John Kennedy told Time magazine columnist Hugh Sidey, "I never met a man like this. I talked about how a nuclear exchange would kill 70 million people in just 10 minutes, and he looked at me as if to say, so what?" Let's face it, who has? And I have every confidence that if I were to be in the room with such a man, I would have been far more freaked out than John Kennedy was. Especially if, like President Kennedy, I'd been trying to cope with back pain with a disorienting cocktail of medications. But that's the point. The tougher the test, or the tester, the more important it is to anticipate what will it be like to be in that room. There seems to be no evidence that President Kennedy role-played for his meeting with Khrushchev. Earlier in this course, I outlined a simple, powerful way to role-play using a method created by Professor Stuart Diamond of Wharton. In essence, you brief a teammate about the upcoming talks, have her prepare as if she were you, and you prepare as if you were your actual counterpart. Then you meet your teammate in character for a mock negotiation. You take occasional debriefing breaks, but then resume and continue for about 45 minutes before dropping your roles and reflecting on the experience. But now we can take that useful approach one step further, using a method I've developed in collaboration with role-playing expert Soren Malmberg, called I Foresaw It 2.0. I Foresaw It 2.0 efficiently combines two tools, the I Foresaw It preparation mnemonic we discussed in Lecture 14, and role-playing into one powerful concept and process. In essence, you take the home role, your teammate takes the away role, that is, you prepare to play act yourself, and your teammate prepares to play act the counterparty. Then, you each separately create a partial separate I Foresaw It plan for your pre-assigned role. Then, you role play. That means you each do certain parts of the I Foresaw It plan that focus on the talks from your character's perspective. You get that? You are intentionally skipping things like empathy and the other side's alternatives to agreement. Why? Because the role play itself will flesh out the rest, and eventually you'll swap plans with your teammate anyway and combine it into a single plan. After you do your separate plans, you do a role play exercise. You meet your teammate in character. Pretend to negotiate for a few minutes. Pause to debrief in character. Resume. Pause to debrief. Resume one more time, and then debrief again. I Foresaw It 2.0 and the role play exercise together probably take about 25% more time to do than a basic I Foresaw It plan does. But they may produce even more remarkable advantages than either approach alone. That's because your teammate is a realistic stand-in now, and because he's embodying informed insights about your counterpart. If you take the exercise seriously, you may well be able to capture the emotional reality you'll face. You'll face real arguments your counterpart may raise, real facts he may throw at you, real tactics he may employ. Now, of course, like any simulation, there's no guarantee, but it's a big step forward. I Foresaw It 2.0 is a lot like going into a flight simulator and safely learning to fly a plane on the ground. And whether you're learning to fly or negotiate, the more challenging the simulation, the readier you become. In 2009, pilot Chesley Sully Sullenberger's plane hit birds minutes shortly after takeoff from New York's LaGuardia Airport. Suddenly, the plane was without thrust 3,000 feet up. Sully had 2 minutes to get the plane down. Incredibly, he stayed calm and landed the plane safely on the Hudson River. even though landing a fully loaded commercial plane on water is extraordinarily difficult. He later said he was quite scared, but he still performed beautifully and calmly. How did Sully do that? A key was this: he'd practiced that very maneuver in flight simulators. That's the power of simulation. Now, if time is short and the stakes are low, it may make sense to simply do a basic eye for saw it and simply role play. But using an eye for saw it 2.0 is like going from a desktop flight simulator to an airline simulator. A richer experience that can get you readier for the stresses to come. But now, let's turn to a specific and profoundly unnerving source of emotional and psychological stress in negotiation: threats, lies, and bluffs. These are classic sharp bargaining tactics, which we've hinted at previously, but they deserve our special attention here because of their inordinate ability to stress us out and leave us anxious about the talks. Soviet diplomats were particularly famous or infamous for this approach, turning tables over, stalking out, lying, and making extreme demands as ultimatums. To cope, Western diplomats learned firstly that they had to be patient, expecting this behavior, not reacting to it, and learning as much as they could to help spot lying. This tracks with sports agent Bob Wolf's advice that you have to cultivate the reputation for being smart and honest, in part to strongly discourage the other side from playing tricks on you. I find out everything I can before a negotiation, Wolf says, as we've seen. Knowledge is power, which means that factual research is a critical protection against dissembling. As we've seen, studies find that we are very bad at spotting lying from body language alone. But it's another story when the other side says they never got the package and you quickly check with Federal Express and discover that the other side signed for it that very morning. That's the power of research. Another way to cope with lying and such is to ask questions that you already know the answer to. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy asked Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin if the Soviets had offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba. Kennedy had clear photographic evidence that the answer was yes, but he did not reveal that fact. Dobrynin calmly assured the president that the answer was no. Kennedy thanked him at the end of the meeting, but from then on he knew that the Soviets were lying to him and that he needed to proceed with extreme caution. If you have reason to suspect that the other side will threaten you, lie to you, or intimidate you, it's a good idea to role-play the negotiation. Ask your teammate to push you even harder than you expect your actual counterpart will, and play out the conversation until you feel ready for those really tough tactics. Also important will be developing a deep understanding of the alternatives to agreement, theirs and yours. They may want you to believe that they are strong and that you are weak. Is that really true? Even if it seems to be true, they may have hidden worries. Role-playing can be especially important to help you anticipate killer questions, distressing questions that you answer at your peril. A killer question, by design, short-circuits and cripples your ability to negotiate a fair and favorable outcome. For example, asking early on, "What is your best offer?" Here, the negotiator is asking you to simply lowball yourself. Asking, "What other offers do you have?" Here, she's asking you to reveal the strength of your bargaining leverage, or lack of it. Asking, "If I offered you this amount, would you accept it?" Here, she's in effect asking you to make the first offer. She's not making it, and she'll then ask for more. She can still ask for more. Here's the one I dislike most. How much do you currently make, and what are your salary expectations? Here, the other negotiator is asking you to anchor yourself on what is likely a lowball number. I especially dislike that one because so many of my students face it in their new job negotiations. I think that one is especially unfair because it's not only manipulative, it's irrelevant. What difference does it make what you made before, especially if this is a different job with new duties? The real question is, what is fair in the marketplace for this job for a candidate like you? And here's the tip-off that it's unfair. What if you were to ask the employer The same question, how much do you currently pay? And what are your salary expectations? Don't ask that question, but if you did, your counterpart would likely say, sorry, that's private. So why is it okay for the employer to ask you? It's a killer question. How do you calmly deal with killer questions? A key is preparing to politely sidestep them. If you're not ready to do that, you're vulnerable to being taken advantage of, and I don't want that for you. So role play out replies that avoid them. That's important to get. You don't have to answer every question, and you don't have to reveal everything you know or care about. It's no reflection on your integrity or your sincerity or your desire to collaborate to politely say, I'm sorry, but with respect, I can't talk about that. Even Abraham Lincoln routinely avoided difficult questions during the Civil War. When you role play replying to killer questions, practice respectfully and honestly declining to answer. So, for example, you might reply, well, I do make it a rule not to discuss that. I'm sure we'll reach a fair outcome when the time comes. Or, with respect, let me suggest we put that one aside for the time being. You probably would prefer I not ask the same question. Or, you could change the subject deftly. Before we get to that, I wonder if we might make progress looking at this issue or this matter. There's no one right answer, but being ready for such questions is key. One thing about the question, how much do you make and what are your salary expectations? As many of my students find, employers often insist on an answer. So if you must answer, then be ready with a plan B. You might say something like this. Okay, to show good faith, I'll be happy to answer. I just ask that we not use the information later as a benchmark, but that we rely on fair market data. Is that okay? That way, if they later use your disclosure against you, you can still deflect. Well, with respect, you may recall that I shared that information with the understanding that we'd use fair market data. So I've done some research on that question, and I thought I'd share what I found. Beyond preparation tasks, what can you do in the negotiation room itself that could help you manage strong emotions? One useful step is to set discussion ground rules. As a trained mediator, I've witnessed firsthand the power of ground rules to help people deal with strong emotions, even in remarkably difficult situations. For example, as I mentioned earlier, more than once I've mediated disputes between a wife and her husband's mistress. In each case, to my amazement, they reached agreement and wished each other well. There are many reasons why, but one simple, powerful technique was to ask the participants at the outset to agree to a few simple ground rules. Here's what I and many other mediators are trained to propose. First, can we agree that we won't interrupt each other? Mediation participants virtually always say yes to this request. Second, can we agree that we will be civil and not use harsh language toward each other? They always agree to that request too. These rules may seem trivial, but actually they may be crucial. In difficult negotiations and conflicts, real listening is one of the first things to disappear. Agreeing in advance to actually pay enough attention, not to interrupt, is a step toward actual listening. The second rule, requesting civility, can also help lower the pressure and tension, assuring both sides that the conversation won't get ugly. As we've seen, it may not be enough. The other negotiator may simply just shut down and wait for her turn to speak. So you may want to add a third rule. Can we agree that we will occasionally recap what each other is saying? As you may recall, this is quite similar to a discussion rule my wife and I routinely use when we're starting to fight, something we call the fair fight rule. It's a rule that has helped us many times in our long and happy marriage, and that also helps many others as well. Of course, there's no policeman to enforce these rules in a simple negotiation, no mediator either. But if the other negotiator tries to interrupt or use insulting language, you can call him on it politely, reminding him that he agreed not to do that and ask him politely to refrain in the future. Just be ready to live up to the same rule yourself. If your counterpart routinely ignores your requests, that's probably a sign that it may be time to take a break, because the conversation is becoming less and less safe and because the other negotiator is demonstrating that he can't be counted on to abide even by a simple process agreement. Well, you might say, looks like we're struggling right now to hold to the discussion rules we agreed to. Maybe that's a sign we need to take a break. I think I need to do that to make sure our conversation is constructive. When you think we can continue, let me know when we can consider resuming. The goal here is not to be high-handed, petulant, or niggling, but to use the rule as a clear warning indicator that things may be starting to get out of hand. Another way to cope with difficult emotions is indeed to involve an impartial third party who can play a mediating role. Since formal mediation can often seem too serious, you may want to use other language. Why don't we let Uncle Steve sit in on this conversation? Maybe he can help us. Or, it might be helpful to include Ellen when we talk, since she knows a lot about the things we're discussing and may be able to help us make sure the conversation is constructive. But let's face it, there are times when your anger is appropriate, when you need to be ready to say no, where you need to get the other person to get off of it. That brings us to the important, subtle task of using measured anger intentionally. How do you warn someone without provoking him? What's the difference between a warning, and a threat? The answer to the difference between a warning and a threat may be the difference between peace and war, brokenness and reconciliation. To help answer that one, let me do a brief demonstration. This is a bottle of salsa. Now, if I drink it straight up like so, that's spicy. I can barely get it down. But if I take a slice of bread, pour a generous amount of salsa on it, and add another slice of bread, and eat it, not bad. I can still definitely taste the salsa, but the bread absorbs the intensity enough and enough of the spices to allow me to take it in without gagging. In the same way, it's possible to create what we might call a warning sandwich. It has similar virtues. It allows you to communicate something difficult in a way that doesn't provoke revulsion. It lets you say something negative while reducing the chance that the other person will dig in or push back or react badly. It lets you warn without threatening. That's important because when people feel threatened, they fight. The recipe for a warning sandwich is simple and crucial. You start by saying something positive, constructive, and truthful. Next, you say something negative, worrisome, and truthful. Finally, you say something positive, constructive, and truthful. So, for example, I've always had a good feeling about your car dealership and its reputation for value and integrity. I'm disappointed that the dealership won't honor the rust-proofing warranty, and I understand the warranty company itself is bankrupt, but I've learned that your dealership owns it. I hope I won't have to tell the state attorney general about this, though I will if I have to. But I'm confident we can resolve this constructively, and I'm open to different ways to do that, as long as we meet my needs for fairness and prompt resolution. And here's one possibility. The power of the warning sandwich is partly that it lets you signal reluctant but strong willingness to act in ways that are credible and worrisome. But more importantly, it lets you do that even as it helps the other person save face. That's because it starts and ends with respect and concludes with an invitation to negotiate creatively. Now, there's no guarantee that a warning sandwich will always work, and I strongly urge you to treat it as a last treatment option when other more gentle approaches have not worked. A student of mine Once used it in the beginning of a negotiation for a raise. Understandably, the boss was nonplussed, to say the least. You use it to bring the other negotiator back from the edge when nothing else is working. But I and others have used it successfully, and it may parallel ideas advocated by negotiation expert William Ury in his excellent book, The Power of a Positive No. Ury's book and others like it bring us to the idea of setting boundaries, of cultivating the critical ability to say no in ways that don't damage the relationship. No small thing when emotions are high, but doing that can help you manage your emotions more effectively. And here, we can return to the key principle of being hard on the problem, soft on the person. Here are a few examples of saying no without damaging the relationship. Thanks so much for your invitation. While I must decline, I would love to have the chance to get together with you soon. I appreciate that you need my support on this urgent project, and normally I would gladly help. Since you've asked me to make the other project a top priority, and since Sheila has reserved the rest of my time for key meetings this week, I won't be able to competently handle the new project as we'd both like, unless we adjust my schedule in other ways. But if there are other ways that I can be of help after the rush passes, I'd be delighted. It's easier to set boundaries and frame a positive no with a bit of forethought. But if you have to, you can frame one on the fly by saying no in a way that's hard on the problem, soft on the person. Another way to manage strong emotions is to think about the setting and scheduling. As we noted before, no one ever backed down on the Jerry Springer show. With 3 million people watching, backing down is a recipe for humiliation. Choosing a more private time and place for a hard encounter may give you and the other person more room to settle things. So, when a dinner conversation turns ugly, you might wisely say to a family member, "Let's continue this alone after dinner, in the den." Another reason negotiations bring out strong emotions is because they often bring us in touch with shame and guilt. What if your doctor is trying to settle a malpractice lawsuit? Notwithstanding all your valid defenses, what if you're a doctor, I should say? Notwithstanding all your valid defenses, what if you do feel some remorse? This gets us to the idea of offering an apology and seeking forgiveness. I'm an attorney, and I know from training that apologizing can seem suicidal. Most attorneys would never tell their clients to offer one. But curiously, a number of studies have found that when hospitals and doctors offer apologies and take action to make sure a mistake doesn't happen again to others, plaintiffs tend to settle for much less money. In contrast, consider the movie A Civil Action. It was based on a true case involving a company that was alleged to have dumped toxic waste that killed children. There, the plaintiffs walk out when their lawyer, played by John Travolta, merely brings them a money offer from the defendants, but nothing more. Now, apologizing is a judgment call. It's true that it can be risky. In some cases, it may not help. Sometimes it can backfire. Sometimes lawyers are right. And Alcoholics Anonymous warns not to make amends when doing so would hurt someone. But forgiveness is probably worth seeking more often than you first think. A good apology is an unqualified one. One senator who habitually insulted minorities used to apologize by saying things like this: "If I said anything that hurt anyone, I'm sorry." He was voted out of office by a large margin, and you can see why. He was basically saying, "I don't know if I hurt anyone, and I don't even care enough to find out if I did." But what if he'd said this: "You're right, I was wrong. Here's how I hurt you. Here's what I'm going to do to make it right. I ask for your forgiveness." Very different vibe. Forgiveness seeking is not about groveling, it's about respect and truthfulness. You can still advocate for yourself, and maybe better, once you've acknowledged the elephant in the room and dealt with it. Once you have, you can of course say, "We do have a number of additional things to talk about too. Would this be a good time to do that?" As we've seen, there are several psychological traps to watch out for in intense negotiations beyond the other things that we've just discussed. Here are a few. Escalation psychology, deal euphoria, the fear of deadlock, anchoring, the endowment effect, and reactive devaluation. To manage these and other psychological traps, it can help to intentionally use the measures of success we've previously identified. That includes comparing the offer to your interests, your BATNA, your best targets, and your independent criteria. Separately, it can help to be accountable to others who are less emotionally invested in the talks. It may also be wise to change negotiators or decision makers. The New York Police Department hostage negotiation team routinely rotates its negotiators after a few hours, precisely because negotiators can get too emotionally involved. Similarly, it may be wise not to let the same person in your organization try to settle a conflict she was intimately involved with starting, since her judgment may be skewed. To sum up then, how do you cope with strong emotions? Among other things, role play and plan, respectfully sidestep killer questions, set discussion ground rules, take breaks, warn wisely, set boundaries, consider apologizing, and get support. Anger, guilt, fear, and psychological traps are one thing, but students often go further and ask me this: it's one thing to hold it together and apply my training in negotiations with an equal, but what if I'm really, really weak and the other is really, really strong? Or if the other side is a villain or an enemy, can I negotiate? Should I even try? And let's face it, if we can only negotiate with equals or friends, the negotiation training may not help much, since so much of the time we feel like we are dealing with Godzilla, a terribly powerful counterpart who can easily squash us, or a devil who wants to. What can we do in these situations? It turns out we may actually be able to negotiate, influence, and even lead Godzillas. And there are often times when it is wise to talk to enemies. We'll see how in our next session.